Hey, I wanted to let everyone know as you are filing in here for this discussion, we have it on mute and everyone on mute here for the moment. We're going to start this up in about 1 minute. We just want to give people a chance to join in first. Hello and welcome to this discussion from the Chronicle of Higher Education on race and higher education. I'm Scott Carlson from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Welcome to this discussion here, and I want to give some thoughts, some notes quickly on how this is going to work for the course of the hour. First thing, you are on mute by default. You can join this conversation, however, by asking questions in the Q&A box. We are going to be going to questions early and often during this session. And as we unfurl this conversation, I also want to let you know that this conversation is being recorded. So if you are not able to stay through the whole discussion, or if you have a friend that wants to watch this discussion, just ask them to register and they can see a recording of the conversation after this is over. I also wanted to offer a thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has underwritten this event and has helped us tell people about it. Thanks so much for putting on this important conversation. And I wanted to give a big thanks right now to Michael Sorrell, who joins me now in this conversation as the co-host. This will be the first of many conversations we have on race, class, and higher education here with the Chronicle. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, Scott, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you with me. I also want to give a big welcome to the rest of the panelists that are on this session with us. That's Devin Fergus of the University of Missouri. Devin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott and Michael. Great to be here.
Mildred Garcia from the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Millie, thanks for having us here. Thanks for joining us. And Gabrielle Starr from Pomona College. Gabby, nice to see you here.
Nice to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's get the conversation going. We're talking about race, class, and higher education, and we've published so much on this recently, ever since the killing of George Floyd. Michael, where should we begin this discussion? How do we even begin to grapple with this? It's so huge.
No, I think it's a wonderful question, Scott. And let me just say at the outset how much I applaud the Chronicle for being willing to tackle these issues in a substantive way, as we're going to do throughout the entirety of this series. But I think we have to start it from just acknowledging a very basic point that we are where we are as a country because this is what higher education, in a sense, has produced. The reality of it is all of our leaders are products of our institutions. They sat in our classrooms, they walked our campuses, they absorbed what it is that we taught them. And so the reality of it is, if we go back and look at the history of higher education, it was founded to preserve the rights of the landed gentry and their ministry. And so it was founded to maintain and promote elitism. And that's what it's done throughout its entirety. And now we have gotten to a point where we look and realize that we actually should not be promoting elitism. We should be promoting collaboration. We should be promoting respect. We should learn to speak, as we've heard Millie say before, we should learn to speak the language of the communities that are around us. And so I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to explore race, to explore class, to explore higher education. And, really with that, I want to jump in and just ask Dr. Starr, Gabrielle Starr, a question. There's such a thing as survivor's bias, and it's produced in many different ways. And I would argue that many of us are the survivors of the 60s civil rights movement, right? I mean, maybe not from the standpoint that we were part there walking and marching, but we are indeed the survivors of that. And that does create a certain type of bias. As we look at this generation's civil rights movement, what can survivors' bias teach us about what's going on right now and how we go forward in this moment?
Well, thanks a lot, Michael. The first thing is that I think it teaches us to be humble, because survivor's bias leaves you thinking that you did something right and that the path that you took, anyone else could have taken. But a lot of what helped us succeed was institutional. It was things like affirmative action, mentorship, programs that were at colleges that we went to. But a lot of it was dumb luck. And when we look at this generation coming through now, the conditions have both radically changed and they haven't. K through 12 education is at some of its highest levels of segregation since 1954. And if we, as people in our 40s and up, look at this generation and say, well, can't you just do what we did? We are not only abandoning the struggles of those behind us, there could have been 40 more of us, 100 more of each of us, if conditions had been different. So we have to listen to the students and the parents and the families now to see what this generation needs that we didn't have. Yes, it's possible to survive without it, but is it possible for the many more people to thrive without it? No, or we would have been done by now.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I want to now ask this question of Devin. And let me just say that I am just getting into your book, The Land of the Free, and it is fascinating.
Thank you.
Right? I wish that I had given myself enough time to read all of it before we got to this, but I'm going to get there. Listen, with that in mind, really let's talk about the history of how we get to this place.
Well, absolutely. And Michael, actually, again, thanks again for inviting me. I'm gonna pick up though on a thread that Gabby mentioned about dumb luck, because I love the phrase. Speaking of wonderful books, a few years ago, I read a book by economist Robert Frank, I think called Success and Luck. And Frank argues that luck is actually the residue of design, right? And he talks about all these sort of almost near-death experiences that he has. And one of the ways in which his life gets saved is because of a robust public health system that actually is there to save his life in moments in which his life is actually in personal crisis. And so, yes, dumb luck exists, absolutely right. But unless you have a robust, let's say, public infrastructure, public education system, luck often falls by the wayside. And so luck is important, but luck often comes into play when you have a robust sort of public health system, public education system, public infrastructure, talk about paved roads. And so luck is important, but luck often needs a more robust sort of public society and civil society and public funding to make luck actually function for each and every individual.
So can I ask you a quick question on that point?
Yes, absolutely.
Following that stream. So then what you're saying is that we have created a society where people have been legislated to be unlucky.
Precisely, absolutely right. This is what Frank is arguing. Absolutely right. So absolutely correct. Yeah. So but Michael, get into your question about the sort of history. And certainly since World War II, higher education has been a pathway to upward mobility into America, frankly. But increasingly what we see is that since the late 70s, 1980s, that there have been basically barriers erected to make college campuses less a site of upward mobility than a site of indebtedness. And this particularly has an impact on historically marginalized populations, women, people of color, and it really starts taking off in the late 1970s, 1980s. Let me give you a brief sort of example. In the late 70s, early 1980s, a Pell Grant, for instance, could pay for 2/3 of a cost of college. And when I say cost of college, I talk about not simply tuition and fees, but also room and board. Fast forward to 2019, 2020, basically a Pell Grant pays for less than half of that cost for college. And so, how have basically students tried to make up that difference of Pell Grants? Obviously, got things like student loans, and these things have a disparate impact on folks of color. What we know is that folks of color are far more likely to take out student loans than a broader population. We could have that conversation, particularly about the disparate impact that these policies have had on folks of color. But we see that the rising cost of college in the last 2 or 3 generations have erected barriers to access, frankly, for historically marginalized populations, not simply folks of color, but for women as well, frankly.
And I was going to say that's by design.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And when Scott says it's by design, historians like to talk about unintended consequences, right? And you might plausibly make the argument that the rise in cost of college had an unintended consequence on people of color marginalized populations. But while it might be unintended, it certainly wasn't unimagined. I mean, in the early 1980s, they're actually talking about what impact the rising cost of college and things like the decline of the purchasing price of a Pell Grant would have on folks of color. So they knew it would have a disparate impact. And they took the opportunity costs, as folks, policy makers and public affairs scholars talk about. It took the opportunity cost and built it on the backs of historically marginalized folk, frankly.
And I would add something else on this, that the state disinvestment of state colleges and universities, especially the regional comprehensive institutions that I represent, went down when students of color and underserved students were coming into our institutions. And when we look at who is the new majority in this country, we are putting barriers up to the very individuals that we have to educate, not only for themselves, but for the lifting up of the states and the nation.
Millie, that is such a great point. I literally was going to ask you about this. I mean, so do you think, because I find it fascinating that the people who are sitting in the legislatures are graduates of the state, by and large, are graduates, the elected officials are graduates of the state's publicly funded institutions. And so the idea that they would vote against the interest of their alma maters seems fascinating to me. And I think about, well, why would you do that? And I wonder how much of it is what you said, maybe because they don't look at them as being there the same that they were when they were there.
I also would say that many people have bought into the elitism of higher ed. All these donors that give money to the institutions that need it the least. When I kept saying when I was president, if you give it to a regional state college or comprehensive, you are paying so many more tuitions and fees for people that need it, rather than these institutions that have the endowments to support the students that they are admitting.
Gary, you put a hand up there for a second. Did you have a point off of what Devin was making?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I had a point about what Devin was thinking. And Millie has talked a little bit in more depth about this concept of structural luck and how that plays into just some of the damage that is being done to this generation. But I wanted to add in the moral luck question, which I think in some ways ties us back to the tragic death of George Floyd and so many others, in which these structural considerations then leave us in a world in which the same action can lead to disaster or success. And then in some cases, we think of them as moral, and in some case, we think of them as immoral. So you have someone who has striven their whole lives to make it to college, and they do the exact same thing. They work hard, they do everything that is right, but they don't get either the moral kudos for it. They get assailed by guilt. And that happens for people of color, it happens for women, it happens for anyone who finds themselves in a world in which the strains of constraint that we all live under don't require us to make moral choices, but don't allow those moral choices to flower in some way, and to ethics and to success. And we don't want to struggle with that as a country. We don't want to struggle with that in the world. You know, when we use the dreaded terms like white supremacy as being one of these structural things that undermines the ability of people of color to have opportunity, grasp it, and succeed with it. People think that we're saying, oh, you are a racist, or this is racist. No, what we're saying is that there is structural luck and moral luck that enables you to do so much. And gives you, you're born on third base, you did not hit a triple. And it's just being able to come up with language to talk about this is so hard, especially when, as Millie points out, the resources have been diverted in ways that continue to undermine everything that we want to do.
And the public doesn't want to pay for state colleges and universities at a time when they are majority people of color at our regional state colleges and universities. They just feel, well, that's not my issue anymore. And so the issue for us is all about how do we educate a public that it's a public good as well as a private good, and that they have forgotten that educating the populace is a public good, leading people into living in a democracy, which is we're at jeopardy right now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And some of our research look at the state of Ohio, where I used to live, and where in the 1990s, I think 44 students at the state of Ohio going to college bore 44% of the cost of college in that state. And the Ohio Board of Regents' objective was to reduce that cost. So they go to the state legislature lobbying it, petitions to reduce that cost in the 1990s. Not simply don't they reduce the cost, but cost actually increases for college students to above 50% by the end of the decade. Now, in the state, while they didn't want to fund public education, they did want to fund 2 sports stadiums in Cleveland and Cincinnati. Right. And I think both Millie and Michael sort of alluded to this. And there's little political price to be paid by elected officials for disinvestment of higher education. I talk about Ohio. Ohio is twin Michigan. Similar sort of thing happens there, frankly. But there's little political cost to pay for defunding higher education. Now, we're in the middle of a conversation about ostensibly or putatively sort of defunding police departments. No public elected official wants to be out there on the front lines defending that. But they will, in part, easily defund higher education without any kind of electoral cost. And this first happens at the federal level, in fact, in the 1980s, where presidential administrations began to defund and de-escalate its funding for higher education. It pays no political cost for doing so. And then it begins to trickle down to the state level, where again, elected officials pay no political cost for defunding higher education.
And have been given license to say something. My biggest surprise in going to Washington and being in DC is going to the Hill and having elected officials say to me, well, not everybody needs a bachelor's degree. And I want to say to them, is it your children or your grandchildren?
Oh, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's always the people who have gone to college, whose kids have gone to college, that talk about not everyone needs to go to college, right? Which is just disingenuous. And but I'm not going to go down that line. But let me ask this question, and it touches upon something you said, Devin, that I think is fascinating. We are in this moment of police reform, okay? And in this moment of police reform, which rightfully needs to occur, but we are having selective amnesia about what took place in many of the communities which cried out for the need for more policing, right? When we had the crack epidemic, in the 80s and 90s. And this is particularly sensitive to many historically Black colleges, because I don't know if everyone realizes this, but historically Black colleges are not in predominantly white neighborhoods, right? So all of us tend to be in predominantly Black neighborhoods, and many of those neighborhoods don't have the economic investment that you see in counterpart. I mean, it's fascinating. If you come to Dallas and you drive literally same highway up to SMU, you can't help but notice how much different the neighborhood surrounding SMU looks than surrounding Paul Quinn. In fact, the highways change names, right? You go from 75 to 45. So you get a 30-point, decline just in the name of the highway coming south to where we are. But what I worry about is when we talk about defunding the police, the affluent neighborhoods are still going to receive the resources necessary to ensure their safety and quality of life. The neighborhoods surrounding our institutions and surrounding, and not all of historically Black colleges have this issue, right? But many do. Those neighborhoods are already struggling with public safety issues. So what exactly does that mean for those individuals? And since many of them, many neighborhoods are around school, what does that mean for the safety of the students?
You're right in the sense that public safety is critical for communities of color. And it's really the ways in which law enforcement interacts with those populations is the question, not their presence, but the ways in which they interact with those populations. And we see this through cities, frankly, urban areas across America, from coast to coast. And so it's the ways in which those interactions take place, I think, is the question, not necessarily their presence. The militarization of the police is so fundamentally problematic.
Absolutely.
And we've seen great examples in Camden, New Jersey, for instance, of the ways in which police departments have been, I should say great examples. We see promising examples, perhaps better practices, not necessarily best practices, of the ways in which police departments have been dissolved and reformed and reshaped to have more of an interaction and better community sort of relations. So yeah, that's in part what I would sort of say about the issue.
And how are we educating our police officers and professionals? What are we doing in our institutions in order to be able to connect them to the communities with which they are going to be serving? And how do they understand the communities and work within those communities? We also have to take a responsibility in higher ed because many of these police officers are coming right out of our institutions.
Absolutely. And that's so, I hate to sort of monopolize or point a conversation, but that's an excellent point too. I think what we see in earlier generations, baby boomers, Generation Xers, they took nary a class on diversity, frankly. Today, someone who's a millennial or Generation Z, they might take one required course on diversity. And so the ways in which universities themselves might have more diversity courses as part of its curriculum, something that's required, and not simply the absence of one course, but something which is more holistic in terms of undergraduate population's education, I think would be useful.
And if I'm sorry, Gabby, go ahead. You go ahead.
Millie.
And if we're honest, if we look at, and I've looked at many curriculums across the country, what is accepted as a diversity course comes into question.
Sure.
So are we going to be authentic about teaching people about diversity, social justice, and equity? And how does that look within the curriculum? And how do we hold faculty accountable for that and not allow these courses that are really on the borderline of satisfying that diversity requirement?
Sure.
Devin, you're at a school that has had in recent history some real difficulty in this area. What have they gotten right? What have they gotten wrong? I know you're tenured, so you don't really have to think about telling the truth. But
no, I do because survivor bias still exists post tenure. It doesn't go away. So it's real. No, you're absolutely right. And I'll say this: my presence here at Mizzou is in many ways a push-pull factor. What sort of pushed me here was my previous institution, maybe the lack of aggressiveness on issues of diversity at some level. what pulled me to Mizzou, frankly, was the fact, and this gets back to, I think, some of the earlier points you sort of raised, is that that you had not simply undergraduate students who were protesting, but a football team at an SEC institution,
Yes.
right? And again, a major athletic program willing to risk, right, the scholarships and possible future careers, putting that on the line. That actually attracted me to this institution. And so, yes, then in 2015, 2016, there were student protests over the rise of sort of microaggressions, or the presence of microaggressions, the creation of an inhospitable sort of racial environment for Black students. And then also, this gets back to what Gabby mentioned about structural luck, the removal of workplace benefits, particularly around the issues of healthcare, health insurance. As a graduate student goes on, has a hunger strike, and so that it prompted sort of protests on campus. And so what they've gotten, and so they removed some of the higher level officials and administrators. And then there was a backlash, actually, and this gets back to the big issue, right? There was seemingly a backlash among two populations, the state legislature and Missouri residents. And there was a decline and drop in enrollment, frankly, and they point to that decline and drop in enrollment because of campus sort of protests. And so we can talk about campuses as being spaces of elitism, but in many ways, even when those who come from historically disadvantaged populations try to have a voice, there's often a backlash from the majority population. In the ways in which, how does one, as a college administrator or a faculty member, stand up on principle and willing to accept the backlash that's going to come from state legislatures and from the residents as well. And this is something that's historical. It happens in the late 1960s, 1970s, when there's protests on college campuses, even at not simply at public universities, at private ones as well, the backlash among alumni. And so that's regularly going to happen, and the ways in which administrators respond to that backlash, and as well as state legislators, is the critical sort of question, frankly.
Let me ask this question. Oh, go ahead, Gabby. I'm sorry.
You know, one of the reasons I came to Pomona College was that Pomona was one of the first institutions in the nation to include the idea of working in a diverse classroom as a criterion in our promotion and tenure standards. Not a separate criterion, but that you would, as a professor, need to think about who was in your classroom, what their different levels of preparation might be, how you could bring every student into your class. And our faculty did an extraordinary study where they set up cohort classes, and they really set it out by high school preparation in biology at first. They taught the smaller cohorts for students who had had less preparation separately. They gave both sets of students the exact same exams, and the difference in scoring was statistically insignificant. And that experiment that our faculty did motivated other faculty members to say, we need to think about our pedagogy and the way that we teach. At the same time, we have two extraordinary faculty members. One brilliant astrophysicist who is of Mexican heritage, one brilliant materials scientist who is of Caucasian heritage, taught together a course they they start off with a section called Decolonizing Physics. And what they do is they go through ancient history and they look at the ways in which different cultures were doing analyses of the night sky and bringing in ancient practices from Mesoamerica, from Africa, from China, from the Middle East, in order to say this is something that even 2,000 years ago, we human beings were able to do. You are able to do it too. Huge backlash in some media outlets. What do you mean decolonizing physics? Isn't physics just physics? Physics is people learning physics. And then one final example that I'll give is our math department. Most of us have had a math class where you're on the blackboard and your teacher will say, you recall that the second derivative is calculated thusly. Well, half the people don't remember because that was last semester or last year. Half the people never knew it because they hadn't had that class. And those people who don't know it or don't remember it feel that everybody else knows it. They're shoved down a level, and then they start from feeling that they're the only kids who don't know. So our math department made the conscious decision not to use that language anymore. One other example, our chemistry department decided to teach first semester chemistry pass-fail, with the idea that the students would know what their grades were, but there wouldn't be any competition. The course would be taught. She does a lot of, okay, did you not get this? Just click the buzzer. I won't know who it is, but let's keep going until everyone understands it. And she calculated what the grades would have been and what they were, which was pass-fail, and the grades would have been higher than in the course that if taught the regular way. And so I think a lot of this is really trying to think about who is in our classrooms and what they need. Because if people 1,000 years ago could calculate to within 1/100% the movements of the stars, there's no reason that someone born in South Central LA to a poor family can't do it either. And so these myths that we have created are so pernicious. And why do we keep them? They don't make any sense.
Well, don't we keep them in part because we don't have enough diverse voices in the room to point those things out, right? I mean, that's part of the real issue, which, really brings me to a question I wanted to ask you and Millie, as women of color who have led institutions that are, diverse, but typically have not been led by women of color. How do you navigate this environment, and how do you navigate this environment while also using your authentic voice, right? I mean, because there's a political price to pay for authenticity. So maybe you can share, because I know, I've looked at some of the questions people have asked, and, they want to know, how do you use your voice in an environment where your voice is not the majority voice?
Millie's been doing it for longer than anybody. And,
Well,
and she's younger than everybody.
Well, thank you for that. I would say, I went into this business as a first-generation college student. My parents always told me, never forget where you came from, and that my family keeps me humble. I'm just Millie at home. And as I took leadership positions, who you hire as your administrative team is critical, not only for the passion and mission of the institution, but the diversity. You cannot ask faculty members to hire diverse faculty when all your entire administration is white. You are not role modeling it. You're not using a bully pulpit. You're not using your mission. You need to have a strategic plan, and in it be comprehensive and hold people accountable and be unapologetic. Yes, there will be backlash, as Devin spoke about, and people will say, I was turning the institution to a Hispanic institution every place I went. People were telling me to go back home, and I always told them I'd go back to Brooklyn. But I kept my eye on the prize. And the prize was every student that walked in through our door would get a quality education, and we were going to zero in on student success, which meant graduating with a high quality degree. If you can't take the heat, you should not be a senior administrator. You've got to stay true and battle the fight. And yes, there are risks, but I always felt you have to be true to who you are and your authentic self.
And the only thing that I would add to that is that there is so much good research that I am happy to make the argument and to bring the data out, and then to help in some parts the data speak for themselves. And my father came to college late in his life. He graduated from college in his late 30s, and then he got a PhD by the time he was 43. And one of the things I was leafing through his dissertation about 4 months ago, and he had he had this whole big flow chart, and he had written about the difference between knowledge that is gained that has no emotional penalty to it, and knowledge that is gained that has an emotional penalty. Knowledge that you get that costs you is harder to obtain. And I think that when we talk about as people of color, women, LGBTQIA plus individuals, all of us, people who have come from working class families or migrant families, the working poor, you've had to learn what you've had to learn. A lot of it has come with an emotional cost, whether it's getting up every day, whether it's dressing like you had, like, you know, you came out of a field, whether it's being spat on going to school, or whether the content of itself, what you were learning itself, was emotionally wrenching. For me, learning about slavery, that's emotionally wrenching. Every bit of knowledge about that I have, and every time I access it, it accesses hurt. It's not neutral information to me. And so what we have to do is recognize that our knowledge is hard fought. And since it's hard fought, we have to be committed to carrying on that fight, because otherwise it's too painful, it's too unpleasant, and it'll be forgotten. So if we're going to preserve the knowledge of human dignity, then we're going to have to live it.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question, both to Gabby and to Millie. You know, Millie, pertaining to what you were saying about which institutions are funded and which aren't, and Gabby, to your point about what's valid places of academic study and what isn't. You know, Kathleen Fitzpatrick has this book called Generous Thinking, and part of the point of her book is that higher ed is so fiercely competitive between students, from professor to professor, from student to student, from institution to institution, that they end up undercutting the kind of progress that they want to make on various issues. And I wonder if higher ed's intense focus on competition is also one of the factors that really hampers it in terms of grappling with the race and class issues.
Go ahead, Gabby, you start first.
Well, we started off talking about collaboration. One of the things that I think that makes the United States an incredibly lucky place is that we have such a diversity of institutions, from community colleges to the regional publics, to the flagship publics, religious colleges, small liberal arts colleges, big research universities, that the sense of competition is in many ways real. There's competition for funding from the sources, but the ways that we can incentivize collaboration, I think, are much more important. So I've been involved in a couple of collaborations that I worked at NYU for 17 years of my career. There are things I could not have done if I had not been able to collaborate on one hand with the Borough of Manhattan Community College on a STEM pipeline. I couldn't have been able to help launch a prison education program if we didn't have articulation agreements with community colleges in the area, because it was a medium security prison and students would thankfully be released. If we didn't have a collaboration we got money from both the city, which was using confiscated goods to return that into incarceration to education funds, from the Mellon and the Ford Foundations. So we needed to have public partnership to put that into play. And then we needed collaboration from the correctional authorities in the state of New York. And without those none of us was in there doing it for the money, because there isn't any in it. Every drop you get goes right back into the programs. And they're just some of the things that we can't do on our own. And that's one of the things that makes me very worried about this COVID crisis, is that it is shutting us off from each other in ways in which we should be pursuing collaborations to help to reach students who couldn't otherwise be reached. Right now, the estimate at one point from the Economist in March was that 1.5 billion children had educational interruptions this year. Some in this country who nothing after March. Some of those students will be showing up on our campuses. And what are we going to do about it? The study by a colleague of mine here in Drabi after the 2005 Pakistani earthquake that showed that those students whose educations were interrupted were 2 to 3 years behind their peers. There is no way we're going to be able to lift ourselves up if we don't lift ourselves up together. And I think we have a responsibility to collaborate across all of these levels.
So that's great, Gabby. And I like to add, you know, we have bought into the elitism of higher education. And we can't do this alone. Going back.
When you say we, who's the we? Just tell people who the we is.
We in higher ed can't do this alone. Going back to Gabby's point of collaboration. When we look at how the media portrays our certain segments of our institutions, when we look at how the donors want to give to the big names, when we look at how government talks about the different sectors. But if we are really interested in educating the new majority, the underserved, why aren't we talking about helping those institutions that are the less resourced and are really educating the new majority and ensuring that those resources are going there to help them lift this population that we're going to need so desperately? We have actually decided that, hey, you know, right now, if you look at performance funding, for example, well, how do you do a flagship institution and a regional institution and say, well, they're graduating more students than those students came in very well prepared. And some of our students came from institutions of no fault of theirs that didn't give them the strong foundation they needed. We need to rethink, if we're really interested in educating the underserved, where should our resources be placed and where do we put the emphasis? And we need all of the stakeholders helping us do that, including the alumni base.
But Millie, I want to push you on this. You're making an assumption that we actually care about educating the underserved, right? I would argue that what we see right in front of our eyes is that what institutions seem to really care about, seem to be rewarded for, is becoming one of the 40 schools that can claim that they're one of the top 20 schools in this country.
Let me push back on you. That may be in certain sectors. But when you look at ASCU institutions, U.S. News and World Report does not come into the spectrum here. The presidents I am working with, quite frankly, are dealing with student success and how do they do better? Are they perfect? Absolutely not. But they're trying to learn what is the role of administration to change the trajectory of the students that are coming in. Now, I'm not saying it's for moral reasons. They're being held accountable by their public boards. Yeah. And they're saying some of them are very into it. And I can give you names of all of the almost 400 institutions that I'm serving. We're serving 3.5 million undergraduates in this country, most of them students of color. And I will tell you that the ASCU presidents I'm working with have to ask not only for help, but sharing promising practices to get better. So I hear you, Michael, but we can't paint all institutions with the same paintbrush. Just like we say, oh, there's so much debt and it's $100,000. Come on, ASCU institutions don't even charge between $12,000 and $14,000 a year. Maybe too much money for some, but it's not the high tuitions. So we can't paint all of higher ed with the same paintbrush. And there are some people out there that really care.
So let me say this. I am not painting all of higher ed with the same paintbrush. I am merely acknowledging that there is a significant segment that functions that way.
No question.
And they are rewarded from functioning that way, right? I am actually making the case that you're making that we need to hold up those other institutions that are doing this the right way, that want to deal with these issues, because they are out there and they're doing wonderful work, but their stories aren't told enough.
They don't get the press and they don't get the
That's
resources. They're doing it on their own dime and on
Right.
the backs of dedicated faculty, staff, and administrators.
And my point is, those are the people who we need to lift up, that we need to give more, because look, I mean, when I get to travel the country again, right? But having traveled the country, looking at the work that's being done in the sector that you're describing, like, it's extraordinary. But you would miss it and think it never takes place because you never hear about it.
You know, and the research is showing who are the engines of upward mobility.
That's right.
Chetty did that research and it was pretty clear. Jorge Claude de Alba did that research. It is these ASCU institutions that you are just highlighting that are really lifting up the populace with less resources.
And I think they're going to be particularly important in this era as we claw our way back, because the communities that are being torn apart by these issues, these community issues, you know, they need their institutions to put their arms around them in the way that they've always been doing.
Yeah,
and
but
those
I'm
things
worried.
need to be highlighted.
I'm worried because the research I read this morning from Strata, their survey showed that over 50% of Latinos have changed their plans for going into higher ed in the fall, and over 40% African Americans and Asian Americans.
Yeah.
And so they're not going to be coming to our institutions. And the question for me is, what are we doing to reach out to help them change their minds? Because after COVID, most of the people are underserved, they're unemployed. A lot of people are unemployed, they don't have jobs. Pell, as Devin said, does not cover everything. And so it is hard going. And so I am worried.
Yeah, let me chime in a bit too. Just prior to the pandemic, a group I work with frequently in DC, Prosperity Now, did a study working with debt counselors in the Black community, asking them what are their primary concerns in terms of debt. And what stood out to me, what struck me, was that I would assume that it would be rent-to-own stores or payday lenders. No, just behind credit card debt was actually student loan debt. And again, the ways in which student loan debt impacts middle class and working class Black folk, as really the major thing, as the major impediment for them having access to a quality, affordable education. And what we all know about student loan debt is that it becomes a barrier to asset building because it correlates much more closely with lower credit scores. We all know that lower credit scores often reflect in having higher mortgage interests for their mortgage loans. And so the student loan debt is a major impediment for communities of color. Again, so if we're going to be responsive in part to that population's needs, we need to address the issue of student loan debt. And as sort of Millie sort of mentioned, that same population which had student loan debt as their major sort of concern prior to the pandemic, is that same population which we now find as being not simply unemployed, but also underemployed, according to recent research. And so how do we address this matter of student loan debt so they can go to school? Now I've taught at institutions, I've taught at one of the wealthiest institutions in this country, which boasted about the fact that they had the highest per capita student population in the country at one time, right? So I've taught at institutions like that where I see students who have nothing to worry about in terms of student loan debt, relatively speaking, and they have the kind of leisure to engage in conversations like this. And I've also taught at very ethically and class diverse campuses, is to see where that population struggles with doing their work in my classroom, frankly, with engaging and mobilizing and organizing the struggle and protests. And so the ways in which this debt saddles a population that we've all been talking about, even prior to the pandemic, and the ways in which on the other side of this pandemic, it's going to be more of a burden in terms of providing their access to higher education.
Hey, Scott, I think are you speaking? Because you're on mute.
Sorry. It seems like what we're on the cusp of here is kind of a major generational change in terms of who will be entering politics maybe in the future. we'll see one generation sort of leave politics, and there might be a generational change within higher education itself that might start to address some of these issues. There was a question from one of the viewers, and before I get into the question, I just want to say we've had to shut down the Q&A, unfortunately, because we've been swarmed by people who didn't want this conversation to happen, and I'm glad that we're still having this conversation. And I want to say, I'm sorry to the people who are watching. It's disgusting. But one of the serious questions that people asked here is, will the panelists address the question of, whether there should be a change of leadership in higher education? How do we affect change if we don't bring in new people? Does somebody want to address that? What kind of leadership change do we need? And is there a willingness among a younger generation of people to accept leadership positions in higher education? You often hear that this is a sort of a difficult thing for people to wrestle with.
So I'm just going to mention that ASCU has this program called the Millennium Leadership Institute that was started in 1999 by African-American presidents who wanted to diversify the presidency and wanted to ensure that we had people committed to the very issues we are talking about. I must say I was in the first class and was the first graduate to get a presidency out of that 1999 class. And that class, that continues. We have served over 600 individuals, about 140 are presidents, and some of them have gone into their second and third presidencies. And that is the kind where we have these honest conversations of what it's going to be and what kind of grit and spackle you need to become a president and where you feel you're going to place your emphasis. Those programs are extremely important. I will tell that these young people are very committed in thinking through how they want to give back to their communities, how they want to change higher ed. And the more we have people that want to go into these programs, we have the Emerging Leaders program that's middle as well, middle administrative. We continue to do those kinds of programs. The new Provost Academy, becoming a provost, all of those things, bringing in people who are different to change the conversation. It's a beginning, but it's something that's absolutely important to change the trajectory of who leads and why they lead. Why do you want to be a president?
And I think it's so important that we as presidents make room for our younger staff members to participate in those types of programs, right? I mean, that type of development, that type of opportunity to build networks and expand is important, but it comes at a price. And I think leaders have to create space for their staff members to be able to do those things.
Yeah, that's true. Gabby, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've been thinking that it again, on the public-private kind of partnership and the collaboration idea, that it would really be interesting to bring in some of the search firms and get them to begin to sponsor some leadership academies, because they're being asked to provide leaders of color, and often the answer is, well, there aren't any. And I think that if we can, every one of us who's in one of these positions is in it because there was a search firm that called us. And I think that it would be really interesting for all of us to call Isaacson and SSS Spencer Stewart and the range of them, Storbeck, and say maybe we could collaborate on something so that you can find your next group of leaders by helping to train them.
I think the other group that we have to work with is governing boards. Let's remember
Yes.
who appoints presidents. We have committees with faculty members, we have search firms and et cetera, but at the end of the day, it's the governing board that appoints a president. And we need to start thinking about how do we work with them and not looking at the presidency in this very straight, narrow box of everything you need to do in order to get to that position. It's about skills and what you bring to the table.
AGB, I think, could be a great resource here, as well as ACTA. I mean, just in thinking about where do you where do you want your leadership to come from? There's been a lot of movement. Oh, we want it to come from diverse professions. We want business. We want law. But we also need academics from who are first generation, who are folks of color who had non-traditional paths through academia, who graduated, late, like my father did, so that we can work against the kinds of survivors' biases and begin to assemble leadership groups that truly are open to creativity and to serving our students and to serving the country in different ways. Like, I keep thinking of all of the research that's getting shut down right now because of COVID, and I'm thankful that we have so many great institutions who are doing COVID-19 research. But there's a lot of other research that needs to go on. And we need many more different kinds of people to be looking at it and funding it. I think there's a role for educating philanthropists in this. We're thinking about who to fund. And I think that, there are places like Mellon or Ford, community foundations that could come together as well to talk about, especially in this circumstance we're seeing right now, where so much activism is not coming through traditional channels, right? It's not coming necessarily through the revered institutions of our youth. It's coming through, various vectors. And how do you identify the talent that is there? And how do you help it to grow so that it could be planted in all of our institutions and help bring about positive change?
I just want to ask another question. Are you all okay with going another 15 minutes here? I think we've got enough to discuss. Is that fine with all of you? Yeah. I want to ask another question from one of the viewers from earlier, and it very much reminds me, and it's sort of in line with what we're talking about right now, and it very much reminds me of the article that we ran the other day about toothless colleges when it comes to statements about what's happening right now. And someone asks here, how does a college president determine the line or gray space of engagement between making statements and taking leading action? This seems like one of those issues where if the president is too engaged or too disengaged, either way it can go awry. Any thoughts about that? And then thoughts on top of that about, colleges sort of protecting their space from a risk management point of view, from a public perception point of view, in a way that prevents them from making bold choices, bold decisions, bold movements. Millie?
I would start with, statements should not be done in a vacuum. It's what have you done as you became a president? How have you looked at your mission statement and your strategic plan and had a comprehensive plan on doing things along the way? You have to get the trust of your constituencies, the students, the faculty, the staff, the alumni, of what you have been doing from the moment you walked on that campus. And so that when a statement comes out, a statement is based on your vision and mission of your institution as you're moving it forward. To bring out a statement and you've done nothing before, there is no trust and people don't believe you. And then you hear about the toothless document. But you have to begin working on all of these issues the moment you got on that campus, understanding who you are serving, understanding your communities, and taking action. For me, as I served as 17 years of presidencies, I was so engaged in the community where I learned so much about Samoans and Tongans and Vietnamese and Mexican Americans. And so I was in those communities. And if I couldn't speak that language, I'd bring an alumni with me who would help me penetrate those communities to understand what they needed and what they wanted. And we even had an educational fair with many, many partners, and Univision as our partner. And our last fair was 50,000 people. Everybody spoke Spanish, booths from K to 12 like IKEA, and ended up with a FAFSA workshop in Spanish so that families would understand how to do a FAFSA workshop. Those are the kinds of things that people need to begin to do in order to gain the trust that you are working on issues of race, class, underserved, and working on social justice.
I just add that, you know, again, it's all about outreach. And it's not just about outreach into the pipeline, which we keep talking about as if we are in some form of assembly plant, which God knows we need those. But we have to realize that there are multiple places in which outreach must occur. And I'm going to get some burns for saying this. I am not a fan of bridge programs as outreach, because I don't think that a bridge starts at one end, namely the college, and goes to somebody else's home. I think that outreach needs to try and meet people where they are and build bridges to each other. And you know, the phrase, nothing about us without us, I think we have to take that very seriously. And so the levels of outreach that we do need to be very careful, and we need to think about what problem we are trying to solve with the outreach. And the answer has to be very carefully tailored. You know, so we've got a great program here called PAYS. Start off with kids in high school. We work with them for 3 years. It's a bridge program to college, almost 100% successful. The kids do a really amazing job. We work with families, and we feel like it is a partnership. And I think that that's what we really have to do when we're working in prison. And I'm very worried about what some of our outreach is going to look like. In the COVID-19 crisis, I'm not sure how we're going to do prison ed. And I want to start some conversations with folks about, because it's hard to get in the laptop, it's not impossible. And these are institutions where we're seeing very troubling outbreaks of illness, and illness vectors are crucial to understand. I'm very concerned about outreach to elder people. We have programs in which we're fortunate to have a variety of retirement communities around, and we bring in regularly folks who lived the civil rights movement, or lived Stonewall, or lived Cesar Chavez's revolution, and they can talk to our students about what that means. So we don't want to give that up. We just have to come up with new ways of making sure that with vulnerable populations, we are doing our best to be responsible. I mean, there's no such a thing as purely safe in this world, but being responsible and safer about how we carry these outreach missions are, because we're in danger of shrinking our horizons while the economic, the human costs of this pandemic, which are being disproportionately borne by folks who already are poor, who are minority, and are uneducated, which is why they can't work from home. All of us, we can get on and work, but there are plenty of people who have to put their bodies on the line if they're going to make a nickel. And so I think part of what we need to do as higher education institutions is begin to address that world that is struggling so hard right now, and come up with creative ways to do it.
So I want to ask around that, right? Because one of the things that, I oftentimes hear people say is, well, where are we supposed to get the money to do these things, right? So we've talked about the disinvestment that we've seen at the state level in higher education, and coming at a time where, if we are honest, we have to do prison outreach. We have to do a better job of community outreach. We have to address the fact that there are tens of millions of people with some college and no degrees that aren't able to fully participate up to their abilities economically. But we also have K-12 that is going to need us also. So how do we do all of those things, right? I mean, to me, the power is in collaboration, right? Like, all of us don't need to do the same things, but all of us need to do something. So how would you do that? And Millie, I think about what your organization with the membership resources and the size of the schools can do. Have you all had conversations about how you can address some of this?
Yeah, we've talked about how do you collaborate within your region, right? And how do you do that? And how do you reach out not only to the foundations in your region, to your alumni base? And, you know, Gabby was talking about the data, but it's data and stories, for example, that get to the heart of those donors. Put those students in front of them, and they will bring out the tissues and start crying with you of the stories that they have gone through in order to get a college degree. It's utilizing your local media to tell the story and have relationships with those local media. It is moving, having institutions in your region, like Gabby said, are asking institutions, your relationship with the community colleges, your relationship with P12, putting people at the table, not as you're the best and the best because you're higher ed, but as equal partners to put together a plan. And so, yes, we've talked about it, and it's within your context, right? It's not going to be the same collaboration in each area. There are rural institutions, there are urban institutions, there are institutions that are suburban. And so how do they do that within their context? But you're absolutely right. We have to do this collaboratively, and we also have to look at how do we share resources, right? So for example, when I was at the CSU, I was sharing a risk management position in order not to have a full-time risk management position. How did we buy technology together in order to get a better discount? So we have to look at those efficiencies too. And then we have to be honest about ourselves. We have to hold up that mirror and say, what are we doing that's not effective? And if it's not effective, why are we putting the budget to that particular area? I'll get dinged for that. But the truth is, we've got to be really honest about how we look at ourselves internally.
Thank you. Gabby, the same question to you.
Wow. There are so many of our institutions that are poised not to survive in this crisis. And that's, you know, I'm on the equivalent of Millie's state college and university board, but just in California for independent colleges. And one of the things our membership is saying is that, you know, liquidity, being able to make payroll is under threat. And it should not be a pandemic that closes institutions that are serving people well. You know, again, all of these different kinds of higher ed institutions that we have in this country are our strength. And if we let 20% of them fall away, we are going to be in a world of hurt, and not 20 years, in 5 years. And look for partnerships where you might not expect them. So one quick example of this I'll give on the K through 12 level, and I'm interested in having further conversations about how we can participate in it. You know, the Fairplex here in Los Angeles County, home of the World's Fair, home of lots of NASCAR. They also have an organic farm, and they run a jobs program, a green jobs program, in collaboration with Cal Edison. Then they're training people, alternative kids who were probably not going to finish traditional high school. They're training them to do green jobs within the energy industry. That's beautiful. And that works because the Fairplex is a 501c3, not just, you know, the venue where you can go hear Beyonce. And those kinds of things, and saying, okay, well, what can we do that's some part of it? Do we have faculty that can come in and work and do some experiments with solar with those young folks? You know, maybe some of them will take that and then we'll decide to go into college later. Can we, you know, begin to expand, and then just listen to these kids and learn what's happening within their neighborhoods. So I think that we have to look in not the usual places. The U.S. military, you know, there are lots of veterans initiatives now to bring in folks into higher education. And then finally, and perhaps most controversial thing that I'll say, there were lots of things that were wrong with the Marshall Plan, okay? But, you know, the last 3 big infusions we've had into higher education were the Land Grant Act, the GI Bill, and Pell Grants in the US. And we were in desperate need of something like the Marshall Plan for our own country. And we're in desperate need now around the world. General John Allen Brookings has been talking for years now. He sees young men and women age 18 to 32, he is responsible for their lives. And, you know, the last thing he wants is a war. That's not why he's a general. He's a general not to have a war. And he has talked, and I've heard him speak really eloquently on what we are facing globally with a population that age, primarily of young men who have no educational possibilities, or very few economic possibilities. And what will they do? They're not going to be quiet. So education is not just about jobs for us in this country. Education is about being able to have a peaceful and productive society. Some people hear that as indoctrination. I read something online, I'm not going to give it any extra press, but blaming higher education institutions for indoctrinating us in false ideas about how the world works. We're not systems of indoctrination. We're systems of truth. And there is a truth to be had in preserving human knowledge, building on human knowledge. We fought too hard for that. And so that is what we owe to the next generation. And if we fall down, it's not 20 years from now. It's much, much closer than that.
That's what makes this era so dangerous and scary, is because we've entered into a time where people believe that the ignorance is the equivalence to the truth. Mm-hmm. And it is not. If anything, we should be doubling down on education and making sure more people have access to it, because frankly, there are some scary alternatives to what occurs when that doesn't take place. Devin, you look like you had something you were about to say.
Yeah, well, and again, Gabby's absolutely right about in terms of the Marshall Plan, in part creating post-World War II period designed to stave off social royal, primarily in Western Europe, right, the unraveling. And my sense is that there is not a commensurate sort of fear in American society as of yet that such an unraveling is going to happen in the U.S. at the actual moment. My broader point, and I think you just part hit on, is really the intergenerational assault on expertise in the academy. And it doesn't come primarily from communities of color, I'd say. I think communities of color have a abiding faith and deep trust in comparatively speaking, in access to higher education and higher education. And in government more broadly, right? There was a research report study released a few weeks ago saying that Latinx and African Americans are willing to allow governments to download apps to do contact tracing in the ways in which white America is not, right? So people of color have a much more abiding faith and trust in institutions of government. It stops with things like law enforcement and the criminal justice system, right? But outside of that, there's this, and look at the ways in which really the government itself has been the conveyance of upward mobility in Black America, in terms of things like public employment at the local, state, and federal level is the primary conveyance for Black upward mobility for that population. And so, but in the broader society, there's been an erosion of trust in faith in government, and more broadly, faith in expertise. And that redounds negatively to the academy. So I think, and if you want to look at this as a glass half full, there's a market out there with people of color who are willing to embrace outreach by institutions of higher learning. Where there's a gap in the alienation, I suspect, is with the broader society, especially with the rhetoric of the ways in which the academy is embracing quote unquote diversity, or we're moving toward a race plural America. Whenever I use that phrase, I can just see it puts some folks on the edge of their chair. It alienates it, right? And there's also research that shows that the language of race plural or majority minority society actually moves people to the racially conservative camp. And so how do you address these broader issues, the broader assault on expertise, the broader assault on institutions of the public, as you try to embrace and provide this outreach to communities of color? How do you square that circle or untie that sort of Gordian knot is the question.
Well, we have gone far past the time that we had set out. This has been an incredible conversation, but we are going to push the boundaries even a little bit more on the time perspective and ask each of our amazing panelists to give us some closing comments. And why don't we start with Millie, then we'll go to Gabby and then Devin, and then Scott can take us home.
You know, I'm an eternal optimist. And while we're going through so many challenges, this country has gone through many challenges. And now it's more important than ever for the underserved, the people of color, as you look at who's marching and who's lifting their voices. And as Devin said, this population, the research I'm looking at, African Americans and Latinx populations understand the importance of higher education. They are not turning their backs. And my question is, why is it that people don't want higher ed to be as successful? We are educating the new majority. And what that means is that those individuals will be in positions of expertise, of leadership in our communities, leading our nation into the future. And I just think that we are going to succeed. There are so many of us there that are still pushing that envelope. This illustrious panel that I have honored to serve are all there marching the fight. And so for me, this issue has to continue to be discussed on campuses. We have to help our institutions learn how to do that, because they're being very honest. They're asking for help. And we need to give that help in order to have these deep conversations and to lift higher ed and really serve the students that are the new majority of this country.
Thank you, Millie. Gabby?
Thank you again for having the panel. I too am an optimist, or at least I try to be one every day. But I have good reason. I'll say that it's become very common to say that our students are snowflakes. They can't take it. These students have taken, many of them, more than most grown folks have ever had to in their lives. And they're asking us, many of them, for one simple thing. Those of us who are parents, those of us who are aunts and uncles, those of us who deal with children, we teach them to use their words, right? They say, use your words when you're upset. We say, don't act out, speak, call it the name that it is. And what they're seeing systematically, and maybe this is about to change, is people, to quote Gulliver's Travels, saying a thing which is not. They'll say, no, that's not racist. No, that's not sexist. No, that's not homophobic. No, that's not the result of class disparity. And they're looking it dead in the face. And they're going to continue to see the world as it is. And if we keep telling them that that's not the truth, they're not going to think that they're crazy. They're going to think we are. So it's our job to call the things, the names that we are, that they are, and to speak the truth so that they don't think we're hiding anything from them, because they're not 2 years old anymore. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges. And when I'm 70 and ready to take my hand off this wheel, I feel pretty comfortable that the kids who are coming up now, they will be ready to drive this car. And that's what allows me to sleep at night.
Let the church say amen. All right. Devin?
Yeah, no, so just sort of pick up on carrying on some of those things. Absolutely right. What makes me feel good is this the current generation that I've had the pleasure of teaching. I had the pleasure of learning from. More importantly, that includes my nephew Diego at Purdue and my niece Bella, who just graduated from Texas, as well as young folks who are doing incredible things, like Kennedy Mitchell, right, who's getting a dictionary to revise their definition of what racism is. The young lady who filmed the murder of George Floyd, to let the world see. Emmett Till's lynching in the 21st century. So I see incredible things from this young generation. And my question is, in this moment of crisis, how do we seize that opportunity and build coalitions across race and class in ways in which, as we move toward a more race plural nation, we can seize it and provide a real multi-racial democracy that has really never functionally existed in this country, because the world is listening and the world is watching. I lived in the UK last year, and as bad as things might seem here in terms of what's going on campus, the alienation of people of color, it might be worse elsewhere. And so how do we seize this opportunity by building coalitions and bridges across race, class, and sexual identity orientation lines? That's where I'll sort of leave it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very quickly before I turn it over to Scott, I will just say thank you to all three of you for participating in our initial discussion. Judging by the volume of people who attended, judging by the rich comments and the Q&A, I think it's hard to say that this was anything other than a success, that people are hungry to hear from you and these topics and these perspectives. So thank you for that. I'm excited about how this conversation and these topics will go on for the summer. Again, I want to thank Scott and the Chronicle of Higher Education and the Gates Foundation for their willingness to engage in this topic and in this moment. With that, Scott, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I would say too, for starters, apologize on behalf of the Chronicle and myself for the kinds of things that you saw in the Q&A. I'm going to figure out a workaround for that for the next conversation. That's not going to shut down this conversation. And in fact, we're going to broaden it and take it in directions that are really, really important, including one of the conversations coming up is going to be about K-12, with people from K-12 talking about the pipeline to college. And I can't wait for that conversation to happen. Also want to give a thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that helped us put this on. Thanks to you, Michael, for joining me and hosting this. Thank you so much. Thanks to our three panelists for joining us here. And thanks to all of you for sticking through this conversation, paying attention, asking good questions. And we hope to see you at the next installment of this, probably in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you.
Hugs, virtual hugs, everybody.
Virtual
Take care. Bye-bye.
Virtual hugs.